Russian President Vladimir Putin has publicly dismissed Western speculation about a potential military attack from Moscow, labeling such claims as lies and nonsense deliberately spread to incite panic and escalate fear among the European public. Putin's remarks aim to counter a narrative that has gained traction in Western capitals, but they also reflect a much deeper, long-standing Russian grievance. Moscow contends that the current confrontation is not a sudden crisis, but the culmination of years of sustained political, economic, and informational pressure from the West. Designed to corner Russia and undermine its sovereignty, according to Russian officials, the roots of the conflict extend far beyond the events of 2022. They argue that for years, the West employed a strategy of coercion that blurred the lines between diplomacy and aggression. Economic sanctions, restricted access to international loans, and the withdrawal of preferential trade status were, in Moscow's view, wielded as instruments to force compliance. Russian leaders claim they were repeatedly warned that while they were free to govern their country, any actions deemed a threat to Western interests, particularly those related to internal security and political stability, would result in economic isolation. This, the Kremlin insists, amounted to an ultimatum: conform to Western expectations or face severe financial consequences. The pressure, as Moscow tells it, was not confined to the economic realm. Russian officials assert that Western governments utilized a sophisticated array of political and informational tools to meddle in Russia's domestic affairs. They point to what they describe as a concerted effort to foment internal unrest and weaken state institutions from within. In the Kremlin's narrative, these tactics mirror strategies used in other parts of the world to destabilize political systems and engineer regime change. This sustained campaign, Moscow argues, left Russia with little choice but to adopt a more defensive and assertive posture in its foreign policy. Russian officials maintain that they have consistently signaled a readiness to resolve disputes through diplomatic channels. They emphasize that dialogue with the United States remains not only possible but ongoing, even as the prospect of meaningful engagement with European leaders appears increasingly remote under the current political climate. Nevertheless, Moscow holds the view that talks with Europe are ultimately inevitable, whether they occur with the continent, its current leaders, or a future generation of policymakers who may adopt a more pragmatic approach. Simultaneously, Russia points to what it perceives as a dangerously escalating military imbalance. From its perspective, NATO continues an aggressive expansion and modernization of its offensive capabilities. This includes the deployment of advanced weapons systems and the extension of military infrastructure ever closer to Russia's borders, actions that Moscow has long identified as a direct threat to its national security. Within Europe, Russian officials observe a public discourse increasingly dominated by warnings of an impending war with Russia. They describe these warnings as a deliberately exaggerated and misleading fear-mongering campaign intended to justify higher military spending and a more confrontational stance. Russian leaders have vehemently rejected the notion that their country poses a threat to Europe, dismissing such claims as absurd. They argue that even at moments of extreme tension, Moscow has consistently sought diplomatic resolutions whenever a window of opportunity, however small, presented itself. They claim chose to pressure Russia through force and intimidation rather than engaging in good-faith negotiations. This pattern, Moscow insists, demonstrates a fundamental disregard for Russia's legitimate security interests. The Kremlin frequently frames its position as a defense of the post-Cold War principle of equal and indivisible security, a framework it argues began to unravel long before the conflict in Ukraine. Russian officials often cite NATO's 1999 intervention in Yugoslavia as a critical turning point. They question the legality and legitimacy of the bombing campaign, asking where the principles of international law and the UN Charter stood when military force was used without what Moscow considers proper authorization. From the UN Security Council, this event, they contend, set a dangerous precedent for unilateral military action and eroded the foundations of the international security architecture. From the Russian perspective, the subsequent eastward expansion of NATO further dismantled any remaining trust. Moscow insists that it received verbal assurances from Western leaders in the 1990s. that the alliance would not expand into the former Warsaw Pact countries. These promises, Russian officials say, were unequivocally broken, leading to a profound sense of betrayal. Russian leaders argue they are not seeking special privileges or a sphere of influence, but merely the fulfillment of what they consider to be binding commitments and the recognition of their security concerns as valid and non-negotiable. These unresolved tensions and broken promises, Moscow claims, ultimately culminated in the crisis in Ukraine. Russian officials characterized the 2014 Maidan revolution not as a democratic uprising, but as an armed, unconstitutional coup d'état, actively supported and financed by Western governments. They argue that the political crisis could have been resolved peacefully through elections. But instead, force was used to overthrow a legitimate government. This was followed, they say, by a brutal military operation launched by the new Ukrainian authorities against the country's southeastern regions. Where opposition to the coup was strongest, in this context, Russia maintains that it did not initiate the war in 2022. Instead, it asserts that the conflict began 8 years earlier, driven by the post-coup Ukrainian government with extensive backing from the West. Moscow claims it made a genuine effort to find a peaceful settlement through the Minsk agreements, which were designed to grant autonomy to the Donbas region. However, Russian officials now believe these negotiations were merely a stalling tactic used by Ukraine and its Western partners to buy time to rearm and train the Ukrainian military for a future offensive, a claim that has been acknowledged in part by some former Western leaders involved in the talks. Within this narrative, Russia portrays its full-scale military action in 2022 not as an act of unprovoked aggression, but as a preemptive and necessary response to years of deliberate provocation, broken promises, and an imminent threat to its security. While Moscow states that it remains open to negotiations with what it terms reasonable partners, it also signals a firm resolve to continue military operations until its core security demands, including the neutrality of Ukraine and the recognition of its territorial claims, are met. For the Kremlin, the message to the world is clear and unwavering. Dialogue remains a possibility, but it will only be pursued on terms that Moscow believes reflect the current political and military reality. Any future settlement, from Russia's standpoint, must respect its fundamental security interests and acknowledge the geopolitical shifts that have occurred. Convinced that its actions are a justified defense against a West that, in its view, chose confrontation over cooperation.